Hello, welcome to part 4 of this occasional series of films on family history. And in part 3, we had a brief diversion where I showed you a number of useful websites and internet resources that you could use to help you trace your tree and give it a little bit of colour. So today we're going to return to the actual paper trail using the Astley family as an example. And at the end of episode 2, I had managed to finally uncover the marriage certificate of my great grandparents, James Astley and Ellen Goff. And that's actually opened up the door now, where I can pursue the family line back a lot further. So I'm going to start at that point. So this is a copy of the marriage certificate in question between James and Ellen. And again, I'll just reiterate, in case you haven't seen episode 2, that these certificates cost £9.25 to order from the General Register Office. And in the case of marriage certificates, if you're using a genealogy website such as Ancestry.com or Find My Past, you may as well not bother with purchasing these certificates and look at the church record of the marriage, because it will look exactly like this and have all the same details on it. And you have to subscribe to those websites, but having done so, you get images of all those marriage records for free. So there's no point in then spending a further £9.25 on this certificate. So there are lots of places I could go from here, but in this episode, principally what I want to do is to take you back to the year 1837, because in that year, certification of births, deaths and marriages began. Prior to that, you only have parish records to go on. And shortly after 1837, in 1841, the first useful census took place, which contained the names and addresses of the population. There had been censuses earlier than 1841. I believe the first one was in 1801, but they were normally just head counts, that kind of thing. There was a very rare example, I think it was in Croydon in 1821, where they actually named the head of each household. But prior to 1841, in the main, you don't get names, you just get numbers, and they're of no real value to a person trying to trace their family history. So by using a combination of births, marriages and death certificates and the 10-yearly census, you should be able to go a long way in following your tree back and sidewards and then back down again and putting lots of names onto your family tree. So I'm going to start with the censuses. There's one every 10 years and it takes place in year 1 of the decade. And let's just take the example of my great-grandfather, James Astley. At this point in time, 2015, the last census I have available is 1911. So can I find him on that? The short answer is no, because unfortunately James died in February 1911. And generally censuses take place late April or early May of the first year of each decade. So had he survived another couple of months, he would have appeared on the census, but he didn't. He died relatively young, and he was a minor when he died, which again fits in with my understanding of the family occupation at that time. And he died at the same address as the birthplace of my father, 10 Gibraltar Cottages in Newton Le Willows. So then if we go back 10 years from 1911 back to 1901, again, you'll already know if you've been watching all the episodes in this series, and thank you if you have, that in 1901, my father's uncle Robert was serving in the army in South Africa during the Boer War. And I've never been able to find where my great-grandfather James was in 1901. I have a strong suspicion that he must have been with his son out in South Africa, but I can't prove it. I've never found any military records. But as I've already told you in episode 2, Ellen, his wife, is living in Wolverhampton, as you can see from this census in 1901. She's the head of the family down the very bottom of this page. And she isn't listed as a widow, so you can tell that James is still alive somewhere. You can tell he hasn't died by this point. And she has with her my grandfather Richard, and also a daughter called Jane, and another son called James. And James is the one who died very young in 1903 of meningitis. But you can see from this census as well that both Jane and James were born in Lancashire. So what's happened is sometime in the mid 1890s, the family have moved to Lancashire, where both Jane and James have been born. And Ellen has just returned home just during this period. So it's probably just for the duration of the Boer War, because we know that back in 1903, the younger James dies in Warrington, so they had returned shortly after the Boer War. This is a page from the 1891 census now, so will we have more luck at finding my great-grandfather on this? And the answer is yes, we do. Is the second family down, and in fact this is the only census in which James and Ellen appear together, because they were married in December 1881. They're not together on the 1881 census, so this is the only one where they appear. And you'll see this is a good example of how fairly slapdash the census can sometimes be, that the censor has written her name down as Mrs. James Astley, so he hasn't even put her name down as being Ellen. So were you trying to search one of these genealogy websites, and you had specifically asked to find a page that contained a James Astley married to an Ellen Astley with both names appearing, you wouldn't have found this page, partly because Ellen isn't named, and partly because, once again, the surname is misspelt as Hasley. So it's a good case in point of persevering with your search, because you know they've got to be somewhere around, and don't be too specific at the beginning of your search, and see what you get and try and pare down the results until you get the page that you're interested in. But I can be confident this is the right family. James is working as an iron scaler, which we know was his profession while he was in Wolverhampton, and there are also 2 children there, Robert and Richard being my grandfather and Robert being my great uncle. This is the 1881 census, or a page from it, and we know from his marriage certificate that James was born around 1859, so he would have been about 22 at this time in 1881, and he could be living with his parents. And we know again from the marriage certificate that his father's name was James, so I I could hope to find him living with his parents, but in fact he's not. He's living as a lodger. He's the fourth name up from the bottom there, um, and he's a labourer in the ironworks. So again, that fits. Born in Wolverhampton, and the other clue is that he's lodging with a Joseph Goff, and from subsequent research, I worked out that the Joseph that he's lodging with is the brother of Ellen, whom he later married. So that's obviously how he became acquainted with his wife. So it's only actually in 1871, when James Astley was roughly 12 years old, that we do indeed find him living at home with his parents. This is the page. It's the family at the bottom of the page, a large family, as you can see. And we know from his marriage certificate that his father was James, and there is a James Astley keymaker, which is the same profession as on the wedding certificate of James Jr. But again, this is another example of how censuses can be inaccurate. Don't take them as gospel, because they're not by any means, and there are a number of errors in the census on this page. You've got to really appreciate that taking the census was no easy task. You don't get the impression from this census, but I can assure you that where these families are living were really bad slums. They're tenement buildings, families crowded into single rooms and so on, appalling conditions. And I'm sure the censor didn't hang around, and had to take a lot of details off of illiterate people in a hurry, and he got a lot of the facts wrong. For one thing, James's mother wasn't called Abigail. Her name was Jane, and that's confirmed by his birth certificate and by the 1861 census. But you'll notice that he has a young sister called Abigail, and I think probably what happened was that the censor just pointed at the mother and child that was probably on her knee, and got the name Abigail for both. But in fact, it was the name Jane that should have been written there for his mother. And another thing which is inaccurate, and I know I can prove through certificates in the previous census, is that he has a brother and a sister called Joseph and Mary, and they've got different ages. One is age 10 and the other 11. But in fact, they were exactly the same age because they were twins, born within minutes of one another. So again, that's something that's been done hurriedly and is inaccurate. So it just goes to show that you really have to use broad brush strokes when you're searching the census records. Otherwise, these people are going to fall through the net simply because of all these inaccuracies that have been applied to them in the official record. And notice also that James is 12 years old and he's already no longer at school, no longer a scholar. He's actually working as a key maker as well. So he's probably learning the trade as a journeyman, but he doesn't keep that up through life. So we can expect to find James again on the 1861 census because he would have been about 2 then. And sure enough, here he is. It's the third family down, His father's name James, who is just down as a labourer now. Wife Jane, as I said earlier, and his older brother there, William, whose name we have got from the 1871 census, and he's got two younger siblings at this point, the Joseph and Mary, and this time they've been put down accurately as twins. So that's the earliest census record we have of James, because he was born in 1859, therefore won't be on the 1851 census. So the only other thing that we can reasonably expect to add to James's documentation record is his birth certificate. He was born in 1859, and here it is. So this would tell us some more details now that we wouldn't previously have known. We now know his mother's former name, which was Davis. Not particularly good news, because that's not going to be an easy name to follow, because it's quite a common name. And interestingly, now it tells us that his father, James, was a well sinker. And at this time in Wolverhampton, that was an interesting occupation. Wolverhampton was a new industrial city. It had a very inadequate water supply of drinking water, and there had been two serious outbreaks of cholera, not just in Wolverhampton but across the country. One in 1832, I think the other one was 1848, and it was very important for these young industrial cities to find a clean source of drinking water. So I think there were about 11 or 12 wells that were sunk around this time in Wolverhampton, and James, it sort of indicates that James's previous experience would have been in mining and digging holes, basically boring shafts, and that's how he acquired the occupation of well sinker. So the purpose of this episode, as I said, is to take you back as far as 1837, or as close to it as I can get. But just to point out that there are a lot of names appearing on this tree now, and I'm not just going back at the same point, at the same stage. I'm following all these lines laterally. So all those siblings of James I'm pursuing and then following their descendants, but I'm not using any different methods to what I'm showing you. So let's carry on back. And this is the birth certificate of James, and I've shown you the 1861 census, but we can reasonably expect to find his father and possibly his mother on the 1851 and 1841 censuses. But I'm not going to be able to find a certificate for the birth of James Senior there, because he would have been born around 1832. So that's for another episode. Okay, so this is a page from the 1851 census, and you'll notice at the top there, third name down, is of a James Ashley, who is 19 years old, so that means he was born around 1832, and he's a keymaker, which is the profession that is cited as having in later censuses and on that marriage certificate of the younger James. So I know this chap is the right chap, but things are beginning to get a little bit more intriguing now. This James that we're interested in was born in Wolverhampton, but he's described as the son-in-law of the head of the household, and I'll show you in a moment the previous page, because this family overlap two pages, and again, that's another good tip, is if you find a family at the bottom or the top of a page, always look on the previous or next page, because you'll frequently find further members of the family there that don't show up on your immediate search. So we've still got another page to look at for the 1851 census, but Um, he's named as the son-in-law of the householder, but so are Joseph Ashley and Thomas Ashley, who are clearly his brothers. So they can't all be sons-in-laws. So what's going on? And in fact, it's just a case of the censor using the wrong term to describe them. In fact, they are the stepsons of the head of the house, and that means that I'm only going to be able to find James's mother's name, and not his father's, because he's got a stepfather. But also notice that although James is born in Wolverhampton, neither Joseph nor Thomas are. They're both born in the county of Salop, which is short for Shropshire, one in Wellington and the other in, it looks like Linsell, but in fact, I know from subsequent study that that is Lilshall, which is another small industrial area close to Wellington in Shropshire. So that's now pointing me in a new direction. It's showing me that although James was born in Wolverhampton, his family um, migrated to Wolverhampton shortly before his birth, from that industrial area of Shropshire. And this is the previous page, and at the bottom there you can see two more names. There's a Thomas Lawrence, who is the head of the household, and he is married to an Abigail Lawrence. Thomas comes from Shifnal in Shropshire, and Abigail from Madeley in Shropshire. And all of this is really helped me push my tree back a long way now. Abigail is born around 1793, you can estimate from her given age there. So we're now back to the end of the 18th century. And I know now as well, I have a name for James's mother. Her name is Abigail, but the name Lawrence obviously isn't the name of her first husband, which would have been Astley, and so that name is still eluding me. But there's masses here now to get me excited. All these places in Shropshire, Shifnal, Madeley, Lilshall, forget the other one for a moment, but they're all very Wellington. They're all very close to one another, surrounding the town that has been plonked there in the recent past called Telford. But it's a very significant area in the history of the Industrial Revolution, which I'm going to talk to you about in a future episode. So this is 1851. I've still got the 1841 census to search, and I'm hoping at this point that Abigail will be with the Astley. She'll have a husband called Astley, who has clearly left the scene or died before 1851. But I'm keeping my fingers crossed that he's going to appear on the 1841 census, and that my great-great-grandfather James, who will be 9 at this point, will be living with Abigail and with his true father. So let's see what we get. So this is the result for 1841, and the 1841 census is laid out a little bit differently. You'll always get 2 pages like this, and the James that I'm interested in is at the top left there, 3rd name down, and I'll show you an enlarged version of that area of the census. So I think the census was always written in pencil. Certainly you'll find 1841 censuses are much harder to read, but you can see there are 3 names. You've got the name of James. He's 9 years old in 1841, which fits because we know he was born around 1832. And he's got those 2 elder brothers, Joseph and Thomas, The surname is now down as Hastley, so it's another variation on the spelling of the name Astley. And the other slight problem with the 1841 census is that whereas in later censuses it would tell you the location of their birthplace of each person, now all you get is whether or not they were born in the county, and it's got no for all of them, which again is another error. We know James was born in Wolverhampton, and therefore born in that county, but we would expect it to have a no against Joseph and Thomas, who we know were both born in Shropshire. So the exciting question now is what's on that previous page. We're hoping to find Abigail and the true father of these three brothers. So let's see what we get. So it's disappointing because even in 1841, Abigail and Thomas Lawrence are living together. I'll show you an enlarged version of the bottom right of the page there. So it's got down Thomas Lawrence, coal miner, not born in Staffordshire. And luckily we know from the 1851 census that he was born in Shropshire. And he's married to Abigail Lawrence, aged 45, so she's a good 10 years older than her husband, and again not born in Staffordshire, and again we know she was born in Shropshire. But I've still got one more chance of finding out Abigail's previous husband's name, and that is that I know that her son James married a Jane Davis, and I know that from their son's name being James, and his birth certificate showing that his mother's name was formerly Davis. So I can search for a marriage between a James Astley and a Jane Davis, and hopefully on that it will have the father's name of James, and that will give me the name of Abigail's husband. So what do I get when I look for that? I'm in luck because it tells me that James Astley's father's name was John. So that now tells me, just to recap, that I not only know the name of my great 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 grandmother, being Abigail, but also now the name of my great 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 grandfather, John Astley. And I know that he's deceased by 1841 because he doesn't appear on that census, but at this point in time I don't know much more about him. It confirms on this marriage certificate, which took place in 1858, that he's already dead. A couple of other interesting things about this certificate, one being that if you remember, the son of James and Jane, who was also called James, had an elder brother called William, who was 3 years old in 1861. So he was probably born at or around the time of this marriage, which kind of reinforces my point about James Lancaster and the stigma attached to his birth outside of marriage that I was talking about in episode 1. It was entirely common for that, for that sort of thing to happen, and for children to be born either just prior or around the time of a wedding. Nothing scandalous about it at all. And the other thing to reiterate again is always look at the witnesses of a wedding certificate, because you never know if you're going to find a relative. And you can see there the name of Abigail Lawrence, and we already know from the censuses that Abigail Lawrence is in fact James's mother. She's remarried to a Thomas Lawrence, and had we not pursued the census records, that would just be another name, but we actually know that that's the name of his mother. So I hope that's shown you what you can achieve just by using resources that are available on the internet, um, and using only census records and uh, the birth, marriage, and death certificates that have been available since 1837. And I haven't yet touched on the subject of parish records. We're going to go into that soon in another episode. But I'm gonna leave it at that point. We're at that sort of cut-off period where we're now going to have to rely on parish records. But I've achieved a lot. I've got back to the names of my great 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 grandparents, and I know that Abigail was born in around 1793, so we're now back into the 18th century. And on top of all that, I haven't shown you, but I've got lots of names of other members of this family and followed those down, followed their lives. So the tree isn't just the direct line going back through my father's father's father and so on. It's going sideways, and there's a lot on it that I've got just from the internet. So I'm going to leave it at that point. Thanks again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed it and got something from it, and I'll see you again in the next episode.